The atmosphere of the grand ballroom was electric, a sea of shimmering gowns and tailored suits moving rhythmically under the opulent crystal chandeliers. The event, a gala celebrating the company's stellar year, was as much about networking as it was about indulgence. I stood near the entrance, a carefully curated smile plastered across my face, clutching the weighty box that would soon append the evening's scripted elegance. Alice, my wife of 10 years and the marketing director for the firm hosting this extravagant affair, had yet to spot me. She was in her element, exuding charm, laughing too loudly, and basking in the adoration of colleagues and clients alike. Watching her from afar, I could see why I'd fallen for her. But tonight, love had taken a back seat to something darker. The moment I'd planned for weeks arrived. I approached her as a waiter offered her a glass of champagne. "Jake," she said, surprised. Her voice was as melodic as ever, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. I handed her the box, wrapped in silver paper with a crimson bow. "For you," I said, my voice steady. "Oh, what's this?" she asked, her laugh brittle. Her colleagues turned to watch, drawn by the drama of an unexpected gift in the middle of a crowded ballroom. "Open it," I urged, my tone deliberately light. Her smile wavered, but she complied. Tugging at the bow, she lifted the lid. The first thing she saw was the wedding ring, the one I hadn't worn for weeks. Then the photos surfaced, each one more damning than the last. Alice, wrapped in the arms of another man. Alice, her smile radiant but directed at someone else. A ripple of gasps spread as the contents spilled out, a USB stick resting atop a stack of printed screenshots. Messages exchanged late at night. Declarations of love that were never meant for me. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, her hands trembling. I leaned in closer, my voice low but biting. "Your truth, Alice. Enjoy the rest of your evening." Her colleagues' faces transformed, the admiration shifting to shock and thinly veiled judgment. Someone dropped a glass, the shatter breaking the ballroom's symphony of murmurs and music. As Alice staggered back, trying to process what had just unfolded, the USB stick fell from her grasp. A particularly curious coworker scooped it up, his curiosity outweighing decorum. "Maybe we should see what's on this," he suggested with a sly grin, drawing murmurs of agreement from the crowd. "No," Alice cried, lunging for the device, but it was too late. Someone had already plugged it into the laptop connected to the projector. Suddenly, the party's mood shifted into something surreal. The large screen, meant to display accolades and photos from the year, now showed a series of damning text messages. Messages that made it clear Alice had been living a double life. The guests fell silent, their faces illuminated by the damning evidence. Then, a voice broke through the chaos. It was her boss, a stern, older man whose opinion clearly carried weight. "Alice," he said, his tone icy, "we'll need to discuss this on Monday." Panic gripped her. "Please, this is a misunderstanding," she stammered, but the tide had already turned. The room buzzed with whispers, alliances forming and reputations crumbling in real time. I turned to leave, satisfied that the chain reaction I'd ignited would take care of the rest. But before I reached the door, Alice ran after me, her voice shrill. "Jake, wait. Please, let me explain." I stopped, turning slowly. The crowd was still watching, their curiosity insatiable. "Explain what?" I asked, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest. "That you betrayed me? Or that you thought I wouldn't find out?" Tears streaked her face, her carefully applied makeup smudged into a haunting mask. She fell to her knees, clutching my hand. "I made a mistake," she sobbed. "I'll do anything to fix this." I pulled my hand away. "You didn't just make a mistake, Alice. You made choices. And tonight you're living with them." As I walked out, leaving her crumpled in a heap on the marble floor, the orchestra struck up a tune, a desperate attempt to restore normalcy. But the damage was done. Outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom. My heart was racing, but it wasn't regret or doubt that filled me. It was relief. For the first time in years, the truth was out and I was free. The ballroom, once brimming with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses, descended into chaos. The screen displayed Alice's private messages and photos, their contents leaving nothing to the imagination. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wildfire, each voice more incredulous than the last. I lingered just outside the grand double doors, half shielded by the velvet curtains. Though I couldn't see Alice, her cries reached me. "Turn it off," she screamed, her desperation unmistakable. But no one moved to help her. Instead, they stared at the unfolding scandal, mesmerized and appalled. A few guests, no doubt drunk on both champagne and schadenfreude, began snapping photos of the screen with their phones. Alice's betrayal had gone from private disgrace to public spectacle in a matter of minutes. "Who sent this? Who put this up?" demanded Robert, one of the company's senior executives. His voice, usually commanding in meetings, was now tinged with uncertainty. I recognized him from some of the photos in the box. His expression made it clear he knew exactly why Alice wasn't the only one in trouble. "Maybe you should explain that, Robert," a woman's voice shot back. It was his wife, Rebecca. She stepped forward, her face pale but resolute, holding her own phone aloft. "Because I recognize that message. It's the one you sent her last week." The crowd gasped as Rebecca's trembling finger pointed directly at Alice. My chest tightened as I watched this second betrayal unravel. Robert stammered, his composure slipping. "Rebecca, this isn't the place." "Oh, it's the perfect place," she snapped. "You and Alice have been having an affair, haven't you? Was she worth throwing away our marriage?" Alice, clutching the edge of the nearest table for support, seemed incapable of speaking. The dam had broken, and there was no stopping the torrent of accusations now. From another corner of the room, a furious argument erupted between two junior executives. "That's your wife in the texts, isn't it, Darren?" one man bellowed. "I told you she was cheating, but you said I was paranoid." Darren's face was beet red as he tried to pull his sputtering coworker aside. "Keep your voice down, Ryan. We don't know if—" "We do know." Ryan interrupted, jabbing a finger at the screen. "That's her username. She's been messaging Alice's, whatever he is." "God, you're pathetic." What had begun as a pointed exposure of Alice's infidelity had turned into an unearthing of the entire company's secrets. By now, half the guests had realized that the USB contained far more than just her indiscretions. Texts and photos involving other employees, some tied to scandals brewing long before tonight, were lighting up the screen like a twisted company presentation. "What's this?" someone yelled, pointing to a thread that had just flashed on the display. "Is that Sophie from accounting?" The woman in question was standing near the bar, frozen like a deer in headlights. Her husband was not far away, his face a mask of confusion and anger. "Sophie," he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Care to explain what that's doing up there?" As Sophie stammered out a response, the room grew hotter, the tension palpable. I turned back toward the door, ready to leave the scene behind, but a voice caught my attention. "Jake." Alice's voice cracked with desperation. I turned, meeting her tear-streaked gaze as she pushed through the crowd. "Jake, please. You have to stop this." "Stop what?" I replied coldly, my words cutting through the surrounding commotion. "Stop the truth from coming out? That's rich, Alice." She reached for my arm, but I stepped back. "You don't understand," she pleaded. "This will ruin everything, for everyone." "Maybe it's time things got ruined," I said, loud enough for a few nearby onlookers to hear. "You weren't too concerned about the fallout when you were sneaking around." Alice crumpled, her strength gone, as the chaos around her reached a fever pitch. The scandal had taken on a life of its own, dragging others into its wake. Friendships were fracturing, marriages were dissolving, and alliances were crumbling, all under the glow of the ballroom's chandeliers. I walked away without looking back, leaving Alice to face the wreckage she had helped create. Outside, the night air hit me like a second liberation. Behind me, the once celebratory gala was devolving into something far darker, a reckoning none of them would forget. The night had already spiraled into chaos, but the climax came when a man in a sharp black suit strode purposefully into the ballroom. He carried a stack of papers under his arm, his expression stern and unyielding. His arrival cut through the noise like a blade, and for a moment, the room stilled. Everyone's eyes followed him as he approached Alice, who was still slumped in a chair near the podium, her mascara streaked and her confidence shattered. "Alice Munro?" the man asked, his voice sharp and professional. She looked up, her face blank with confusion. "Yes?" Without hesitation, he extended the papers to her. "You've been served." The collective gasp from the crowd was deafening. Alice's trembling hands took the envelope, her eyes darting from the man to the papers inside. She tore them open, scanning the first page, and then froze. The color drained from her face. "Divorce papers?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Jake, no please." I stepped forward from the back of the room, my presence answering her unspoken question. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, their whispers now focused entirely on us. I kept my voice calm, though every word was heavy with finality. "You made your choice, Alice," I said. "Now I'm making mine." She stumbled to her feet, the papers fluttering from her hands. "Jake, don't do this. Not like this. We can fix this." The raw desperation in her voice didn't move me. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing the strength I would need to stand firm. I knew the humiliation would cut her deeply, but it was nothing compared to the pain she had caused. "There's no fixing this," I said. "You didn't just betray me, Alice. You betrayed everything we built." The room, which had been abuzz with murmurs, now hung in tense silence. Alice's colleagues stared, some in shock, others in barely concealed satisfaction at the unraveling of their once-admired marketing director. Before she could respond, another voice rang out from the far side of the room. "Thomas Caldwell." It was Robert, the senior executive who had been arguing with his wife earlier. His voice was venomous as he stormed toward the CFO. "You've got a lot to answer for." Thomas, Alice's lover, had been standing awkwardly near the buffet, his face a mask of forced neutrality. At Robert's approach, he straightened his tie and tried to muster some authority. "Robert, let's keep this professional." "Professional?" Robert barked, his laughter bitter and sharp. "You've humiliated this company. Your affair with Alice is all over that damn screen, and you think you can lecture me about professionalism?" A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Several executives exchanged glances, nodding subtly. It was clear that Thomas's position was no longer tenable. The whispers grew louder, accusations blending with plans to salvage the company's reputation. Rebecca, still clutching her phone with screenshots of Thomas and Alice's texts, stepped forward. "Thomas, you're done," she said, her voice cold. "Do you really think the board is going to let you stay after this circus? You've destroyed your credibility, and ours, by association." Thomas tried to speak, but his voice cracked. This is a personal matter. It doesn't affect my work." "Your work," another voice chimed in. It was one of the junior executives, Darren, emboldened by the growing mob. "Your name is all over those messages. Clients will see this. Investors will see this. You think that won't affect the company?" As if on cue, someone's phone buzzed loudly, the notification breaking through the tense exchange. Soon, more phones lit up around the room. Word was spreading fast. News of the scandal was leaking beyond the ballroom, spilling into the digital world. Thomas's composure cracked. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. He glanced toward Alice, who was too consumed by her own misery to offer him any support. In that moment, he looked utterly alone. "You should leave, Thomas," Rebecca said, her words cutting through the tension. "Before security makes you." The humiliation was palpable as Thomas turned and walked toward the exit. His confident stride from earlier in the evening was now a defeated shuffle. No one stopped him, and no one spoke in his defense. He disappeared into the night, his career and reputation in tatters. As I turned to leave once more, Alice called after me. "Jake, please. Don't do this to me." I paused at the door, glancing over my shoulder. "You did this to yourself, Alice. Goodbye." And with that, I stepped into the cold night air, leaving behind the wreckage of a life I no longer wanted any part of. The ballroom remained a cauldron of chaos, but for me, it was over. The first thing I noticed when I stepped off the plane in Texas was the air. It was different. Lighter, freer, filled with possibilities. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I could breathe. New York had suffocated me. Every corner of that city was tainted with memories of Alice, our life together, and the betrayal that had unraveled it all. But here, under the wide-open Texas sky, none of that mattered anymore. I'd taken a position with a tech firm specializing in sustainable design, my field of expertise as a design engineer. The offer had come just weeks after the fallout at the ball, almost as if fate had intervened to give me an escape route. I didn't hesitate. Packing up my life in New York had been surprisingly easy. The apartment Alice and I had shared was sold off without much sentiment. The proceeds were enough to cover my moving costs and give me a little breathing room to start over. My first morning in Austin was a mix of nervous anticipation and quiet relief. The city buzzed with a different kind of energy than Manhattan, less frantic, more welcoming. My new office was located in a sleek building with panoramic views of rolling hills and endless greenery. It was a stark contrast to the towering steel and concrete of my old life. As I settled into my workspace, my colleagues made an effort to welcome me. They were friendly, casual, and completely unaware of the storm I'd left behind. It was refreshing to be treated as just Jake, the new guy, rather than the man whose marriage had publicly imploded. In the evenings, I explored the city. Austin's charm was undeniable, its vibrant music scene, food trucks, and warm, unpretentious people. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't weighed down by betrayal. I began sketching designs for a small house I hoped to build someday, something modest but uniquely mine. Though I was cautious about opening my heart again, I didn't want to close myself off entirely. The idea of finding someone faithful, someone who valued honesty and partnership, was a distant hope, but one I held onto tightly. I promised myself I'd take my time, get to know someone the right way, and build trust slowly. No rushing, no blind leaps. One Friday night, I found myself at a local coffee shop. It wasn't anything fancy, just a quiet place with mismatched furniture and an acoustic guitarist strumming in the corner. As I sipped my coffee, I couldn't help but eavesdrop on a conversation happening at the table next to me. A woman with auburn hair and an easy laugh was talking about her recent move to Austin and how she was still finding her footing. She caught my eye as she stood to leave, and before I knew it, I'd struck up a conversation. Her name was Rachel, a schoolteacher who had moved from Colorado to start fresh after her own heartbreak. There was an honesty in her eyes, a kindness that felt genuine. We exchanged numbers, agreeing to meet again for dinner the following week. Back at my new apartment, a modest but comfortable place on the outskirts of the city, I sat on the balcony, looking out at the stars. In New York, the lights of the skyscrapers had always blocked the night sky, but here it stretched endlessly, a reminder of just how vast the world was. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. My marriage to Alice had been a lesson, painful but necessary. It had taught me the value of integrity, the importance of setting boundaries, and the courage it takes to start over. I knew I'd never forget the humiliation of that night in the ballroom or the fallout that followed. But I also knew those memories wouldn't define me. Texas was more than just a change of scenery. It was a second chance, a blank slate where I could rebuild my life on my own terms. And this time, I was determined to get it right. From what I heard later, Alice's downfall was swift and brutal. The same woman who once commanded attention at every meeting and charmed clients with her wit was now a pariah. After the night at the ball, word spread through the advertising company like wildfire. Scandals of that magnitude didn't stay contained, especially not in a world as interconnected as ours. Alice tried to salvage what was left of her career, but the damage was irreversible. Her colleagues no longer greeted her with the same smiles. Their whispers turned to pointed stares. Even her closest allies, those who had always laughed at her jokes and toasted to her successes, began to distance themselves. Robert, the senior executive who had once been her accomplice, was quick to sever all ties, painting himself as a victim of her manipulations. Rebecca, his wife, made sure of that, using every opportunity to remind their social circles of Alice's betrayal. The company's board didn't waste time either. Thomas Caldwell's abrupt resignation as CFO left a gaping hole in leadership, and Alice's role as marketing director was brought under heavy scrutiny. A week after the scandal broke, Alice was summoned to a meeting with the board. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. She was terminated to protect the company's image, a euphemism that barely masked their disdain. Without her job, Alice's once lavish lifestyle began to crumble. The penthouse apartment, the designer wardrobe, the weekends spent at exclusive resorts, all of it was funded by her six-figure salary and the perks of her position. Without those, the bills piled up quickly. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she tried to land another job in the industry, but her name had become synonymous with infamy. No one wanted to risk hiring someone whose personal scandals had bled so publicly into their professional life. The advertising world thrived on connections and reputation, and Alice had burned every bridge. Her personal life wasn't any better. The friends she'd once hosted extravagant parties for now avoided her calls. Her lover, Thomas, was no longer in the picture. He'd left New York altogether, retreating to some quiet, far-off place to escape the fallout. Alice was left with no one but herself, sitting alone in an apartment she couldn't afford, staring at the remnants of a life she'd destroyed with her own hands. I found out through a former colleague of hers that she tried reaching out to me. Letters, emails, even a few voicemail messages, all begging for a chance to explain, to apologize, to undo what she'd done. I didn't bother reading or listening to any of them. What was there to say? No apology could restore what she'd taken from me, nor could it erase the humiliation she had brought upon herself. It was ironic in a way. Alice had always thrived on appearances. She loved being seen as the perfect wife, the brilliant professional, the woman who had it all. But now her name was a cautionary tale, her face a symbol of disgrace. Her life, once adorned with luxury and admiration, had been stripped bare. Some part of me felt a twinge of pity for her. Losing everything couldn't have been easy, especially for someone like Alice, who had built her identity around success and control. But that pity was fleeting. She'd made her choices, and those choices had consequences. Meanwhile, I was building something new, far away from the wreckage she left behind. For the first time, my days weren't shadowed by betrayal or pretense. My nights weren't filled with doubts about what Alice was doing or where her loyalty lay. I had a job I loved, a city that welcomed me, and the hope of finding someone who wouldn't shatter my trust. Alice's story was one of destruction, of trust, of relationships, of her own life. Mine was one of rebuilding. And while her name continued to circulate in whispers of scandal, mine was finally free to rise above it all. Months after I left New York and started my new life in Texas, I still carried a sense of unfinished business. It wasn't about Alice anymore. Her destruction was already complete. No, this was about the others. The ball hadn't just exposed Alice and Thomas. It had cracked open a cesspool of deceit that ran deeper than I'd ever imagined. Before leaving the city, I had discreetly collected digital copies of the materials from the infamous USB. It wasn't just Alice's betrayal contained there. The USB held damning evidence implicating several other executives, employees, and even their spouses. At first, I told myself to let it go, to focus on my fresh start. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that silence would only protect people who didn't deserve it. One night, sitting in my Austin apartment, I sifted through the files. The more I read, the angrier I became. These weren't isolated flings or misunderstandings. They were webs of infidelity, woven with deliberate lies and covered up by people who feigned respectability. I remembered Rebecca, Robert's wife, who had stood up to confront him at the ball. She deserved the truth, as did the other spouses unknowingly entangled in this mess. So, I made a decision. Carefully and anonymously, I began sending the evidence to the people who had the most right to know, the spouses. The emails were simple and direct. Each one contained copies of the relevant messages, photos, and timestamps that left no room for denial. There was no accompanying message, no explanation. Just the raw truth, delivered straight to their inboxes. The fallout began almost immediately. Within days, my phone buzzed with updates from former colleagues and acquaintances. The gossip mills in New York were running at full capacity, and the scandal that had rocked the company during the ball was now tearing through homes and boardrooms like wildfire. Rebecca was one of the first to act. Armed with the evidence I'd sent her, She confronted Robert with a ferocity that left him reeling. "You lied to my face," she reportedly told him, her voice icy and calm. "You made me feel like I was crazy for doubting you, and all the while, you were sneaking around with more than just Alice." Robert's reputation, already bruised, was completely annihilated. Within a week, Rebecca had filed for divorce, making her intentions clear to everyone in their social circle. But Rebecca wasn't alone. Darren, the junior executive whose wife had been implicated in messages with Thomas, received his own set of files. From what I heard, he didn't even wait for an explanation. "Pack your things," he told her the moment he saw the evidence. "We're done." She tried to plead her case, but the messages were damning. Darren walked out that night, leaving her stunned and alone. The scandal spread far beyond the company's walls. Some of the evidence exposed affairs between executives and clients, creating ripple effects that reached other firms. Contracts were canceled, partnerships dissolved, and lawsuits threatened. For every revelation, there seemed to be a new layer of betrayal uncovered. Ryan, who had called out Darren's wife at the ball, turned out to have his own skeletons. His wife received an email too, detailing Ryan's affair with a junior assistant. She wasted no time airing their dirty laundry in public. By the end of the month, Ryan was not only divorced but also jobless, his actions too toxic for even his closest allies to ignore. Through it all, I kept tabs from a distance. The stories trickled back to me in fragments. Whispers shared by mutual connections, social media posts hinting at shattered relationships, and the occasional anonymous tip from someone inside the company. The firm itself was on the verge of collapse, its leadership decimated by resignations and terminations. Clients no longer trusted a company that had become synonymous with scandal, and even the most loyal employees began jumping ship. As for Alice, she was notably silent throughout the aftermath. Whether she was too consumed by her own struggles or simply unwilling to involve herself further, I couldn't say. But her name remained a centerpiece of the narrative, a constant reminder of where it had all begun. I didn't send the evidence out of spite, not entirely at least. It wasn't about revenge. It was about giving people the clarity I desperately needed during those dark weeks of suspicion and doubt. They deserved to know the truth, just as I had. If their lives fell apart because of it, that wasn't my doing. That was the consequence of their own actions, brought to light at last. In Texas, my life continued to move forward. My work was fulfilling, my social circle growing, and my evenings with Rachel becoming more frequent and meaningful. I didn't regret what I'd done, though I sometimes wondered if my actions had made things worse for some of the innocent people caught in the fallout. But then I'd think about Rebecca, about Darren, and about the others who had finally broken free of the lies they'd been living under. For them, the truth wasn't just a reckoning, it was a release. And for me, it was the final step in closing a chapter that had once threatened to define my life. As I watched the scandal fade into the distance, I knew I had done the right thing. Sometimes, the only way to move forward is to burn down what was never meant to last.